Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, let's settle in again. Take a slow breath. Maybe adjust the blanket a little. And let your mind drift into that familiar rhythm where time feels soft and pleasantly blurry. Tonight we're gliding into this endlessly drifting calendar saga. And yes, we're still talking about calendars. Yes, the same two calendars. And somehow, there's still more to say. It's the kind of history that insists on stretching itself out, like a cat taking its time to nap across the entire sofa, where we wander into the long psychological shadow the Julian-Gregorian debate cast over the world. We've talked about the technical transition, the political drama, the scientific arguments. But now we're going to float into the everyday lives of the people who lived through these changes, the small social habits that formed around it, and the quiet confusion that lingered for generations. Because a calendar isn't just a piece of paper. It's the thing that organizes your reality, and changing it, even mildly, reshapes the way people move through the year. So let's ease into that. By the time the 18th and 19th centuries rolled around, more and more countries had switched to the Gregorian calendar, but many people still didn't trust it. And not for deep scientific reasons, just human ones. Imagine being an ordinary farmer in 1752 England, the year they finally made the switch. You've lived your whole life by the rhythm of local time, sowing, harvesting, lambing, all matched to what the sky and soil tell you. Suddenly, the government says they're skipping 11 days. It doesn't matter that the seasons stay the same. Emotionally, it feels like you've been rushed ahead, like someone turned the page of your life too fast. Some people genuinely believed their lives had been shortened, not metaphorically, literally shortened. They thought those missing 11 days were stolen from them. You can't blame them, really. If your concept of time is tied to lived experience rather than astronomical data, losing days feels unsettling. Others just found it annoying. People had plans. People had appointments. People had chores. Suddenly the date jumped and nothing matched anymore. And then there were people who shrugged and went right on with their lives because the cows didn't care what date it was. And the cows were really the ones in charge. Meanwhile, in Catholic countries, where the change had happened earlier, the memory of the switch faded into a hazy cultural footnote. Italy jumped ahead in 1582, and afterward people mostly stopped thinking about it. But even there, the missing days created gaps in legal documents, birth records, and even diary entries. It's unsettling to flip through a 16th century ledger and see time just vanish for a week and a half. It gives the whole thing a dreamlike feeling, like the year blinked. Writers in the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally mentioned the missing days the way modern people talk about leap seconds, with a mild mix of curiosity and indifference. Ah, yes, that was the year we lost a bunch of days. A sentence said as casually as the bakery raised the price of bread. But the real psychological twist came from the countries that switched late. Greece in 1923, Russia in 1918, parts of the Balkans in the 1910s and 1920s. People in those regions were already living in a century filled with upheaval. Wars, revolutions, political collapses, shifting borders. And in the middle of that, the government would announce a calendar switch. It must have felt like one more piece of reality was being rearranged. Imagine living through World War I. Food shortages, political chaos, family uncertainty, and then suddenly learning the date has jumped forward. It wasn't shocking, exactly, but it added a surreal flavor to life. In Russia, the shift in 1918 caused all sorts of domestic confusion. School administrators received new calendars from the government. Factories updated their shift posters. Newspapers printed conversion tables. And people joked that they were leaping into the future because the date jumped by 13 days. Somewhere in all of it, a few people were undoubtedly annoyed that their payday got shuffled. But outside of these local experiences, the transition had deeper cultural effects. One of the slowest changes was the shift from seasonal thinking to numerical thinking. Before the Gregorian calendar dominated, people experienced time through the natural world. Winter meant cold, not January. The beginning of agricultural season meant spring, not March 21st. Festivals followed weather patterns more than dates, and the Julian calendar's drift only reinforced that seasonal mindset. Because dates slowly lost their meaning compared to what the sky was doing. Once the Gregorian calendar came into wide use, people slowly shifted to thinking of time as numbers instead of seasons. They talked about specific dates rather than after the thaw or before the first frost. This change wasn't forced. It crept in gently as paperwork expanded, bureaucracies grew, and industrial schedules became more precise. People needed dates for rent contracts, pay cycles, school terms, vaccination schedules, military service, and travel documents. The calendar became less of a reference and more of a tool. Meanwhile, the Julian calendar, still drifting quietly in religious pockets, kept embodying a softer, older concept of time. It represented continuity, tradition, and spiritual rhythm. Whenever someone lit a candle for a feast day based on the Julian date, they were participating in a system that had barely changed since the 1st century CE. That cultural divide still exists today. The Gregorian calendar tells you the official date. Traditional calendars tell you when life feels significant. And the two don't compete. They complement each other. Now, let's drift into another piece of this long debate. Coordination. Once the Gregorian calendar spread globally, it helped create something the old world never truly had: shared time. Time that was the same across borders. Time that governments could agree on. Time that merchants could rely on. Time that allowed newspapers to report events consistently. It sounds obvious today, but before the 19th century, a week didn't always feel like the same week from place to place. Two countries could disagree on the date by 10 days, and nobody screamed. It was just life. Imagine reading a letter from Germany dated March 3rd when England thought it was February 20th. You'd shrug, translate it in your head, and move on after the Gregorian system won out. The world settled into something calmer, a shared timeline. This helped pave the way for international conferences, scientific collaboration, universal schooling, and eventually the digital systems that run your phone. Without the Gregorian calendar's success, global coordination would have been significantly harder. But even as the world embraced the Gregorian standard, many people held onto the Julian calendar with affection, not defiance. It symbolized something beautifully human. That time is not just numbers. It's memory, custom, identity. To this day, old calendar communities exist across the globe. They celebrate feasts on traditional dates. They mark the seasons according to older rhythms. Some do it because of theology, others because they like the heritage, others because that's just how they've always done it. It's a quiet reminder that even in a world of atomic clocks and satellite timing, humans still cherish the soft, imprecise, nostalgic flow of the past. And that's really the emotional heart of the Julian Gregorian story. Not the math, not the PayPal edicts, not the leap year debates. It's the way people adapted, resisted, accepted, and layered their own meanings onto time. Once the Gregorian calendar settled in as the official system in most countries, you'd think the story would calm down. You'd expect everyone to move forward in a neat line. And they did, but only on paper. In daily life, things stayed messy for quite a while. People still talked about Old Christmas or Old New Year, even in regions that had already switched decades earlier. Old habits cling the way dust clings to old book covers, slowly, stubbornly, and with no real intention of leaving. In parts of Scotland, for example, Old New Year stuck around so long that some families celebrated to New Year's every January. One for the official world, one for the world that lived in their grandparents' memories. You can imagine children asking their parents, "Do we get presents twice?" And parents sighing and saying, "No, but you do get another plate of oatcakes." It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't political. It was just cultural gravity, pulling people gently toward the way things had always been done. The same happened in Ireland, especially in rural areas. Farmers continued tracking agricultural events using older rhythms even after the official change. They viewed the Gregorian numbers with mild suspicion, like something invented in a city where nobody touched soil. Even into the 19th century, some communities planned seasonal tasks by what they called the Old Count, which was based on the Julian cycle. And then you had the Baltic and Balkan regions, where traditions were layered in a kind of chronological patchwork. Families would celebrate saints' days based on the Julian calendar but conduct business using the Gregorian. A wedding might be scheduled on the Gregorian date, but the associated feast might follow the Julian one. One system for paperwork, one for meaning. This duality created a cultural rhythm that wasn't chaotic, it was quietly flexible. People just switched hats depending on the context. Paperwork hat for the official world, tradition hat for feasts, ceremonies, and the heartfelt parts of life. And then there were the places where the calendar wasn't just a practical tool or a quiet tradition. It was a symbol dot, for example, in the Balkans. The Julian calendar became intertwined with national identity, especially under foreign rule. When powers like the Ottoman Empire or Austria-Hungary dominated the region, using the Julian calendar became a subtle expression of cultural independence. It said, "We have our own way of marking time. Thank you very much." So even after civil governments switched to the Gregorian system, churches and communities held onto the Julian calendar for emotional reasons. An emotion, as ever, outweighs math. Meanwhile, the Western world was moving further into industrial time, and this shift caused equally subtle ripples. The Gregorian calendar brought structure, and the clock brought precision. Factories needed shift changes measured to the minute. Railways required synchronized timetables. Telegraphs sent messages stamped with consistent dates. The world sped up in ways that older calendars never expected. People who had lived by daylight suddenly lived by factory whistles. Imagine a worker in 1880s London, watching the smoke rise from chimneys at the same hour every day, knowing exactly when to clock in, exactly when to leave. The Gregorian calendar gave him months and deadlines. Factory life gave him hours and minutes. Together, they shaped a new experience of time. one far less flexible than the seasonal rhythms of the past. Even at home, schedules tightened. Schools printed term calendars. Postal services created delivery routes. Newspapers listed dates on every issue. As literacy increased, more people had access to printed calendars. And those calendars reinforced the Gregorian structure day after day, keeping it anchored in daily life. But traditional calendars, particularly lunar ones, kept their appeal in Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, and East Asian communities. For instance, the Gregorian dates were used for civil purposes, while cultural life revolved around older systems. These calendars weren't replaced. They were simply given their own space. This coexisting system created some delightful annual moments. A person might celebrate Lunar New Year in late January or February, fast for Ramadan based on the moon, observe Jewish holidays that drift across the solar year, and still use the Gregorian calendar to plan doctor appointments and school exams. Time became multi-layered, and the Julian system still played its own part, especially in the Orthodox world, where Christmas, Epiphany, and certain feast days continue drifting gently behind the Gregorian ones. It isn't a defect, it's a tradition in motion. Even today, when people joke that Orthodox Christmas is late, they're missing the point. It isn't late. It's on time according to a different rhythm. A rhythm chosen long before anyone worried about precision. Let's drift a little deeper into another subtle ripple of the calendar debate. How it affected historical memory. Whenever the world changes how it measures time, it creates a kind of ghost in the record. Old dates no longer match new ones. Events shift slightly. Birthdays drift. Chronicles written before the transition no longer line up neatly with those after. This created centuries of tiny confusions that historians now spend lifetimes sorting out. Old-style verses, new-style dates appear everywhere in early modern documents. Letters are double. Diaries list two dates side by side. The shift sometimes makes it look like someone accomplished something impossible, like writing a letter on a date that didn't exist in their country, or attending a meeting before the meeting happened. It's not magic. It's just the ghost of the Julian calendar haunting the paperwork. And then there's genealogy. Anyone tracing their family back a few centuries inevitably bumps into the shift. Records suddenly skip days. Baptisms appear to have been performed before the child was born. Weddings shift months. People who lived through the change often scribbled marginal notes explaining the new dates, knowing future readers would be confused, in a way. The calendar transition created a small historical fog, a gentle fog, but still noticeable. But the deepest psychological impact came from something simpler. The shift from cyclical to linear thinking. Traditional calendars tend to follow natural cycles, lunar months, agricultural seasons, repeating patterns. But the Gregorian calendar, paired with modern industry, pushed society towards straight lines. Linear progress, deadlines, fiscal quarters, school years that started and ended cleanly. Time became something you could count, measure, and standardize. This changed how people thought about history. Instead of cycles, they started thinking in centuries, movements, eras. Instead of repeating festivals, marking the same natural moment every year, they began marking life by numerical anniversaries. Time went from being felt to being tracked, and that shift, slow, subtle, and unintentional, is one of the quiet legacies of the Gregorian calendar. we've wandered through the psychological side of the calendar shift, the cultural reactions, the lingering traditions, the slow adoption, and the gentle confusion that seeped into everyday life. What's left now is tying the threads together in the way history often does, quietly, without ceremony. Because once the Gregorian system became the global standard, people didn't suddenly forget their old ways of marking time. They just layered the new system on top of the old one, like a fresh roof over an older house. The old beams are still there. You just don't always see them unless you look up. This layering showed up in hundreds of tiny ways. In some rural communities across Europe, people still kept track of the old dates well into the 1900s. They'd say things like Old Candlemas or Old Michaelmas, quietly acknowledging a rhythm that didn't quite match the printed calendar on the kitchen wall. It wasn't defiance. It was memory in other places, especially the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The Julian calendar became the emotional calendar used for weddings, saint days, and rituals. The Gregorian one became the practical calendar used for paperwork, schools, and trains. One for the soul, one for the schedule. It's a surprisingly gentle division, and even today, you see this dual world everywhere. A Serbian grandmother might tell you she celebrates Christmas a little later than everyone else. A Scottish island community might still use Old New Year for their traditional bonfires. A Greek village might observe feast days by the Julian cycle, generation after generation. Families from Russia or Ukraine might casually mention our Christmas is in January, as if it's the most natural thing in the world, and for them it is. Because time isn't just a number. It's a comfort, a habit, a familiar space. If anything, the Julian-Gregorian divide taught the world that you can standardize clocks, but you can't standardize how people feel about time. As the 20th century rolled in, bringing radio, electricity, cinemas, airplanes, telegraphs, and eventually television, most people lived so deeply inside the Gregorian structure that they stopped noticing its origins altogether. Its leap years, its months, its tidy orderliness, these things felt neutral, not Catholic, not political, not mathematical, just normal. But in the background, the Julian calendar continued drifting slowly. 1 minute per year, 11 minutes, 12 minutes, a day every century or so. A quiet wobble that didn't bother anyone except church mathematicians and the occasional astronomer with too much coffee and too much interest in equinox calculations. It's almost charming. Julius Caesar's tiny miscalculation, barely a footnote in his empire-spanning ambitions, still sends a mathematical ripple through the world. Centuries after his marble statues crumbled, and Gregory XIII's reform, which started as one of those Vatican "we should probably fix this" projects, ended up shaping the calendar used for every global flight, every scientific launch, every financial quarter, every international meeting. But the debate itself, the long, slow, gentle disagreement, didn't end with a dramatic triumph or a final decree. It just softened, faded, settled into place like dust on old wooden shelves. So let's ease into the 19th and 20th centuries, where the debate takes on a new shape. Less about religion or politics, more about science, industry, and the kind of precision that sometimes makes you question who put mathematicians in charge of anything by the late 1800s. The Gregorian calendar had become the official civil system for almost every major country. Japan had switched. Egypt had reformed its administration. Latin America followed European norms. The Ottoman Empire adjusted its fiscal calendar. Russia, stubborn as ever, held out until 1918. But overall, the Gregorian calendar had taken firm global root. Still, there was a lingering issue. Even the Gregorian calendar, this carefully engineered, scientifically informed, mathematically tuned machine, wasn't perfect. It was just good enough. And good enough is the kind of phrase that invites certain kinds of people to write unnecessarily long academic papers about minor flaws. The Gregorian leap year system fixes the Julian drift by eliminating 3 leap days every 400 years. That's smart and it works. But the calendar still gains or loses very tiny fractions over long periods. Astronomers notice these imperfections almost immediately because astronomers notice everything. They began publishing gentle suggestions on how to improve the system. A few mathematicians proposed calendars with better symmetry. A few national committees in the 1920s even debated whether to tweak the rules again. Nothing happened, of course. Nobody wanted the drama of deleting more days. Europe still hadn't fully emotionally recovered from losing 10 days in 1582 and 11 in 1752. Asking them to lose half a day in 2000 would have caused a small riot, so scientists moved on and focused on something else instead. The clock, because by the 19th century, time was no longer just a calendar problem. It was becoming a global problem. A train leaving one city had to be recorded instantaneously in another. Telegraph messages crossed borders instantly, and factories needed exact shift times until the mid-1800s. Every town in the world kept its own local solar time. Noon was whenever the sun hit its highest point. That meant thousands of slightly different noons spread across the globe. It worked fine when people traveled by foot. It did not work when people traveled at 60 miles an hour on metal tracks that absolutely needed synchronized schedules. Railroads forced the issue. The industrial age essentially held the world by the shoulders and said, "Pick a time. One time, please." So countries began standardizing local time and eventually dividing the world into time zones. This system wasn't created by governments at first. It was pushed by railroad companies, who were tired of running trains through towns that all insisted on slightly different minutes. And as standardized time zones spread, the Gregorian calendar's influence became stronger. People now lived by a global rhythm, coordinated, consistent, mathematically tidy, give or take the occasional daylight saving time argument. In a sense, the calendar debate laid the groundwork for this next stage. It taught the world that agreeing on time was possible. But while clocks were tightening their grip on precision, the Julian calendar remained quietly present in the cultural world, especially in Orthodox Christianity. The Julian calendar's role became more symbolic. It represented continuity, heritage, a link to ancient traditions. And so, even as the world stepped deeper into atomic clocks and standardized time zones, certain communities continued celebrating feasts that drifted slightly behind the Gregorian system, as if time itself were gently stretching. This coexistence created a charming pattern. Some years Eastern and Western Easter matched. Some years they drifted apart. People would compare dates the way neighbors compare weather forecasts. "Oh, we're early this year. Oh, we're late again. Oh, your Easter is next month." Nice. It wasn't a conflict. It was a quirk. But this dual rhythm didn't just shape religious life. It influenced everyday life in subtle ways. In parts of Eastern Europe, families still referenced Old New Year, a holiday celebrated in mid-January by the Julian count. It wasn't official. It wasn't regulated. It was simply something people did because their grandparents did it. A second New Year, softer, slower, calmer, with fewer expectations and no pressure to make resolutions. Honestly, not the worst idea. Meanwhile, some regions kept using the Julian calendar for agricultural traditions, almanacs, and folk rituals. Not because they rejected the Gregorian system, just because seasonal patterns sometimes aligned better with the older dates. When you've planted your crops by the same rhythm for centuries, you don't throw that away because the government prints a new calendar. And while this cultural layering continued, another major timekeeping shift was happening in the background. By the early 20th century, scientists realized they needed a new reference point, not tied to calendars or even Earth's rotations. They needed something more stable, something consistent, something cosmic. The stars. Astronomers developed universal time based on Earth's rotation. Then came atomic clocks, which measured time by the vibrations of atoms. Suddenly, the most accurate human measurement system didn't rely on sunrises or leap years or PayPal rules. It relied on physics. This was the quiet moment when human time separated into two worlds. The calendar world, which humans use to organize life. The atomic world, which scientists use to organize precision. And somehow, these two worlds merged smoothly. Leap seconds were added occasionally to keep Earth's irregular rotation aligned with the atomic clock. Time zones adjusted themselves as countries debated daylight saving time. And the Gregorian calendar became the stable backdrop for all of this revolution. Let's drift back in, nice and slow. We're deep in the era where clocks, cables, and careful scientists quietly took over the job of managing time. While the old calendars, Julian, lunar, traditional, sat comfortably in the background like elderly relatives who still insist on telling everyone how things used to be done. And honestly, everyone lets them talk because it's kind of comforting. We're in the 20th century now, where the debate over the Julian and Gregorian calendars isn't loud anymore. It's just gently humming beneath the surface, woven into culture, science, and daily life in ways most people don't even notice. This is where the story becomes less about arguments and more about how people quietly negotiated with time, because even after the Gregorian calendar became the global standard, the world discovered something slightly annoying. The Earth doesn't spin perfectly, not even close. Its rotation slows down, speeds up, wobbles, stutters. It does little tilt and shift, dances that astronomers politely call irregularities, as if Earth is a slightly eccentric relative who forgets their glasses at restaurants. For centuries, calendars tried to correct these irregularities with leap years. But in the modern age, scientists realized leap days weren't enough. They needed something even more precise, something that could account for Earth's tiny, embarrassing inconsistencies. So they invented the leap second. If the Gregorian calendar is the calm narrator of everyday life, the leap second is the nerdy little footnote added by astronomers who just couldn't let the cosmic math stay messy. Every few years, the scientific community announces that the clock must pause for 1 extra second, like a universal hiccup. Some countries adjust their clocks, others ignore it. Computers panic, servers grumble, engineers sigh, but the whole thing is done quietly, with much less drama than deleting 10 days like in 1582, compared to the Gregorian reform. Leap seconds are practically spa days. But the interesting part is that the Julian calendar remains completely unaffected by these developments. It's like a retired monarch living peacefully in a countryside villa, reading the newspaper and refusing to learn what a computer is. The Julian calendar doesn't care about atomic clocks, leap seconds, digital timekeeping, or satellite synchronization. It just drifts calmly, stubbornly, predictably, one day every 128 years. And while the Gregorian calendar is kept aligned with the seasons by the combined efforts of mathematicians, astronomers, committees, and the occasional panicked engineer, the Julian calendar remains exactly what it's always been. An ancient Roman attempt at math. The contrast is almost poetic. As the 20th century settled into its mid-century groove, calendar reform became something like a hobby for academics. Every few years, someone would propose a bold new calendar, 13-month calendars with even lengths per calendars where the days of the week never shift, world calendars that would eliminate ugly month irregularities, and one particularly ambitious proposal that removed weekends entirely and made every day exactly the same, which no one took seriously except the man who proposed it. Most of these ideas died in committee meetings. A few made it all the way to the League of Nations, which politely considered them before deciding that the world was already chaotic enough without adding calendar revolutions to the list. Even the United Nations looked at calendar reform briefly in the mid-20th century, before quietly backing away as if they'd just realized they were poking a sleeping bear. People tolerated the Gregorian calendar's flaws because it was familiar. They weren't about to go through another global readjustment. Not after the Gregorian switch took centuries. Not after Russia switched only recently. Not after learning that some calendar reform plans wanted to rearrange weekends. No. One was about to accept a system where their birthday fell on a different weekday forever. Meanwhile, the Julian calendar quietly maintained its post, especially in the Orthodox Church. The drift between the two calendars wasn't considered a flaw, it was a feature, a marker of identity, a link to the past, something unchanged in a century that changed almost everything else. When Orthodox Christmas fell on January 7th, Gregorian, nobody blinked. When the Julian-based feasts drifted another day further from the Gregorian alignment in 1900, people simply updated their church calendars and carried on, even as the world built skyscrapers, airplanes, and global communication networks. The Julian system kept its gentle, ancient pace. It's almost soothing, really. But the story doesn't end there. The 20th century brought another twist. A global digital world. Computers needed standardized time. Networks needed synchronized clocks. Astronomers needed ultra-precise measurements. GPS satellites needed atomic-level coordination to not send everyone to the wrong city. This led to the development of Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, a fusion of atomic precision and astronomical drift correction. Every GPS device, smartphone, airplane, and financial exchange depends on UTC. Without it, the modern world would dissolve into confusion faster than you can say time zone settings. And yet, tucked quietly beside this hyper-precise system, the Julian calendar still runs its own course. Used by Orthodox churches, certain cultural communities, and anyone who enjoys traditions untouched by modernity. It's like watching a digital smartwatch and a century-old pocket watch tick beside each other. different rhythms, same purpose, both meaningful in their own ways. But the Julian-Gregorian divide didn't disappear entirely. It just softened into a cultural split. In countries like Serbia, North Macedonia, Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia, people often live with both calendars in small ways. Schools and government officers use the Gregorian calendar. Churches follow the Julian one. Families celebrate to New Year's. Grandparents insist on old feast days. Younger generations plan their vacations by the Gregorian calendar, and wedding dates sometimes get debated based on which calendar gives a more auspicious day. In rural parts of Romania and Moldova, certain agricultural rituals still follow the Julian timing. Even though the official calendar switched generations ago, it's not practical, it's sentimental. It feels right. Time becomes something emotional again, not just mathematical. And this brings us to one of the most quietly important parts of Part 5. The world discovered that time isn't just a system, it's a feeling. People didn't cling to the Julian calendar because it was correct. They clung to it because it felt familiar. It fit the rhythm of their ancestors. It shaped their festivals. It gave them stories. It reminded them of who they were. The Gregorian calendar may keep planes in the sky and satellites aligned, but the Julian calendar keeps traditions alive. We've watched the modern world embrace scientific timekeeping, atomic clocks, time zones, and digital precision, all while the old Julian calendar drifted peacefully in its own soft orbit. Now we're entering the final layers of how this ancient debate quietly shaped the 20th and 21st centuries. This is where the story becomes less about calendars themselves and more about how humans handled the idea of correct time in an age when everything started moving a little too fast. Because even after the world settled into the Gregorian system, one problem refused to go away. People still disagreed about whether time should be natural or mathematical, and this debate shaped everything from international conferences to traditions. Let's drift into it. Gently, the 20th century tries reforming the calendar again, and fails as the modern world grew structured and industrialized. A handful of extremely confident reformers decided it was time to fix the calendar once and for all. After all, the Gregorian calendar wasn't perfectly symmetrical. The months were uneven. Quarters were lopsided. Holidays drifted across weekdays. And March still carried the emotional baggage of being named after a Roman war god. So reformers proposed new systems. Grand, tidy, beautifully impractical systems. Some wanted 13 months, each exactly 28 days, New Year's Day not belonging to any weekday world holiday. Outside the calendar, entirely quarters that matched perfectly, universal birthday week, yes. Seriously, and one mathematician proposed scrapping weekdays altogether because they were inelegant, which is an opinion only a mathematician could love. These proposals were presented at the League of Nations in the 1920s. Committees debated them patiently. Nations sent representatives to listen politely. And then, predictably, nothing happened. Because while the ideas were mathematically beautiful, they were culturally disastrous. Imagine telling the entire planet, your birthday will now be on a Wednesday forever. Your national holidays will move. We're adding a 13th month called Sol. Christmas might fall in the middle of the week every year. Sorry. And by the way, we want 365 days of perfect symmetry. Most countries responded in the diplomatic equivalent of no, and so the reform movement died quietly, leaving the Gregorian calendar in place. Awkward months and all time zones become the real reform while the calendar reformers struggled. Time zones quietly became the real revolution. The world realized that getting everyone to agree on the same calendar was one thing. Getting them to agree on the same hours was a whole new challenge. Trains demanded consistency. Telegraphs demanded synchronization. Ships demanded accuracy. And later, airplanes demanded precision down to the minute. And so by the 1900s, standardized time zones spread everywhere, forming the global time system we live with today. The Gregorian calendar fit perfectly into this structure. The Julian calendar, being independent and tradition-based, stayed in its cultural niche. We ended up with UTC Coordinated Universal Time. For scientific precision time zones for daily life, Gregorian. Calendar for civil structure, Julian. Calendar for religious tradition, a layered system. Surprisingly stable. Surprisingly peaceful. The Julian calendar's quiet survival even as the modern world sped up. The Julian calendar continued drifting. Content, unbothered, with a vibe that says, I was here before trains and electricity. I'll be here after your phone battery dies. By the 21st century, the Julian system was 13 days behind the Gregorian used by some Orthodox churches, preserved in folk rituals, celebrated in Old New Year. Gatherings, respected as a relic of the ancient world, treated with affection more than aggressive. The Gregorian calendar is the accountant of modern time. The Julian calendar is the cozy grandparent who remembers holidays the old way. It doesn't compete. It doesn't correct. It just exists, soft, drifting, gently out of sync, and everyone seems okay with that. Digital timekeeping changes everything except the calendars. As computers took over the world, they introduced a new challenge. Digital systems couldn't comfortably handle dates that didn't line up. Operating systems need fixed structures. Financial systems need stable months. Networks need shared TIMES, TAMPS, and so the Gregorian calendar became entwined with code. Every software program, database, and timestamp format began relying on Gregorian rules. Programmers learned date math the way monks once learned equinox calculations, painfully, with much frustration, and with an occasional desire to throw the whole system out the window. Even the infamous Y2K problem was tied to the Gregorian structure. Though thankfully, nobody suggested switching to the Julian calendar as a fix. That would have been an entertaining disaster, still. Despite the rise of computers, the world didn't revisit the Julian-Gregorian debate. It didn't try to adopt a tech-friendly calendar. It simply adapted the Gregorian one to the digital age, which means that quietly, without anyone really acknowledging it, the Gregorian calendar won by becoming the backbone of the digital world. The calendar as a psychological anchor long before trains, telegraphs, or phones. Time didn't feel like numbers. It felt like the weather, the seasons, the moon, the first frost, the first blossoming of the fig trees. The slow turning of the world was something you saw, not something you calculated. Calendars came later, layers added on top of nature to help organize society. But people still anchored their sense of time to lived experience. When the Julian calendar drifted by 10 days, most people didn't notice because real life didn't drift with it. If Easter landed early, they shrugged. If a saint's feast drifted slightly out of season, they gently adjusted their expectations. The human mind was flexible. Time was flexible. Then the Gregorian calendar arrived, correcting the drift, resetting the date to match the sky. That was necessary for astronomy and theology, but it had an unintended effect. It made the calendar feel authoritative. The Julian calendar worked because people trusted nature more than the numbers. The Gregorian calendar worked because people trusted the numbers more than nature. Slowly, quietly, humans began to live inside the calendar rather than the world. Meeting at 2 o'clock. P.M. Rent due on the 1 SD taxes by the 30 free train at 7:45 a.m. A wedding scheduled for June 12th. Time became structured, numbered, predictable. This wasn't good or bad. It was just new. And it created a subtle shift in how people understood reality. The Gregorian calendar wasn't just a system. It was a psychological anchor for a world becoming more complicated. How the Julian calendar became a symbol of older time as the Gregorian system took over the civil world. The Julian calendar was pushed into a quieter corner. But instead of fading, it developed a new identity. The Julian calendar became a symbol, a gentle, nostalgic sign of the past, a reminder of a world where time was slower and less demanding. Churches didn't cling to the Julian system because they couldn't count. They clung to it because the Julian rhythm represented continuity. Imagine being part of a community that had prayed, fasted, celebrated, mourned, and found meaning according to one calendar for 1,000 years. It wouldn't matter if the equinox was technically off by a few days. The calendar wasn't a tool, it was a foundation. This is why the Julian system survived. Not because of astronomy, because of emotion. When a Serbian family celebrates Orthodox Christmas on January 7th Gregorian, they're not celebrating late. They're celebrating traditionally. When a Russian grandmother lights candles on December 25th Julian, she isn't ignoring the global date. She's honoring the rhythm her ancestors lived by. This emotional dimension turned the Julian calendar into something that numbers alone could never erase. The Gregorian calendar's quiet power while the Julian calendar gained symbolic weight. The Gregorian calendar infiltrated everything else. It became the quiet skeleton of modern life, flexible enough to handle global coordination, but simple enough that children learn it without much resistance. Its power came from being both structured enough for science, diplomacy, trade, and travel, familiar enough to feel natural in everyday life. This mix gave the Gregorian calendar a kind of invisible authority. People stopped questioning it, not because they were forced to accept it, but because it became the default. Airports, computers, courts, banks, universities, governments, all used it. And once something becomes the background structure of everything else, you barely notice it anymore. The Gregorian calendar became like the wallpaper of civilization. You don't think about it unless someone points it out. Time zones turned time into geography. One of the strangest outcomes of the calendar debate was the invention of time zones. The idea that time could change simply by crossing a line on a map is something ancient people would have found hilarious. Imagine explaining to a Roman soldier, if you walk 50 miles that way, it becomes tomorrow afternoon. They would have looked at you like you were describing witchcraft. But time zones were essential. Without them, trains couldn't run safely, telegrams couldn't be coordinated, and financial markets couldn't operate. And time zones weren't just practical, they were symbolic too. They showed that time had become something humans shaped, not something we simply obeyed. We carved the world into 24 narrow slices, each one stepping forward or backward by an hour. And the Gregorian calendar became the global calendar that tied all those slices together. Meanwhile, the Julian calendar quietly refused to participate. It stayed the same everywhere, drifting by the same amount no matter where you lived. In a world of train schedules and time zones, the Julian system remained a soft echo of an older, simpler relationship with time. Modern confusion in a world of layered calendars, even with all this structure. The 20th and 21st centuries still offer plenty of calendar confusion. Humanity is predictable that way. For example, some countries celebrate New Year's 3 times Gregorian, Julian. Lunar, some people celebrate birthdays twice because they were born before their country switched calendars. Farmers in rural Bulgaria still plant certain crops based on old-style dates. Ethiopian communities use a calendar 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorians. Some Orthodox churches celebrate Christmas on January 7th and others on December 2/5 in China. Office workers use the Gregorian calendar but plan festivals around the lunar calendar software. Developers cry every time they deal with date conversions. It's chaos. But friendly chaos. The kind that doesn't bother anyone too much. Because what we actually learned from the Julian-Gregorian debate is that humans can live with multiple systems at once without losing their minds. Here is part 6. Final chunk. 1,600 to 1,900 words. Same sleepy, calm, slightly amused, sleepless historian tone. Completing part 6 smoothly, part 6. The long debate. Over the Gregorian verses. Julian calendar, final chunk of part 6. Let's drift into the last stretch of part 6. The part where the Julian-Gregorian saga settles into the digital era and shows us how a debate that started with Julius Caesar and a handful of Alexandrian astronomers somehow lives on in smartphones, computer servers, and awkward international meetings about daylight saving time. Because even though the grand drama of calendar reform is long over, the modern world still manages to argue about time with an impressive level of determination. It turns out the issue isn't the calendars anymore. It's the people who live inside them. Let's slide into this quietly. The digital world meets ancient time when computers arrived in the mid to late 20th century. Programmers ran into a very funny problem. The Gregorian calendar wasn't designed with databases in mind. Months have different lengths. Leap years show up irregularly. February sometimes gets confused and adds a day. And nothing irritates a computer more than inconsistency. Programmers had to translate the Gregorian system into code, painstakingly teaching machines how to calculate dates the way monks did centuries ago, except with fewer candles and more existential frustration. You'd think this would create an opportunity to redesign the whole system. A fresh calendar built for digital precision. Maybe something elegant and symmetrical, but no. Humanity had finally stabilized its sense of time. Nobody wanted to go through another global transition. So instead, programmers taught computers to tolerate the Gregorian calendar the same way the rest of us do, by sighing heavily and working around its quirks. Meanwhile, the Julian calendar remained fully outside the tech world. Computers don't use it unless someone explicitly tells them to. It's become a kind of optional historical mode within date libraries, mostly needed for Orthodox, Christian feast, calculations, research, astronomical history, translating old documents, and the occasional conspiracy theorist who insists the world secretly runs on old-style dates. It's odd and a little charming that the Julian calendar still exists in modern code, drifting silently like a ghost format, occasionally called upon when someone needs to convert a date from 1750 or calculate. Orthodox Easter. The Gregorian calendar became the default operating system for time. The Julian calendar became a plug-in. Daylight saving time, the new global argument about time once, the calendar debate faded. The world needed a new, time-related argument to keep itself entertained. And along came daylight saving time, an idea that sounds simple but has ruined more sleep schedules than all calendar reforms combined. If Julius Caesar were alive today, he'd probably look at DST and say, "Really? This is what confuses you." Daylight saving time sparked the kind of debate that people have incredibly strong opinions about despite not knowing exactly how it works. It created confusion, missed meetings, MAI'd, parents' hysterical news segments, countless late-night arguments that could have been solved by going to bed. This is the proof that no matter how perfect your calendar system is, people will always find a time-related issue to fight over by comparison. The Julian-Gregorian argument was calm and dignified. The rise of the global holiday calendar. The 20th and 21st centuries also introduced another interesting twist. Global holidays rooted in the Gregorian rhythm. Holidays like New Year's Eve Day. Global cinema releases international sports events. Black Friday worldwide. Vacation seasons, New Year countdowns watched on live streams. These events are tied to the Gregorian calendar in a way no traditional system ever achieved. You could be in Tokyo, Toronto, or Tbilisi, and you'll still see the fireworks on December 31st. The modern world created a shared, emotional timeline built on the Gregorian structure, even as people keep their own traditional dates in the background. This dual rhythm is one of the most peaceful outcomes of the whole debate. Calendars no longer compete. They layer. The Gregorian system runs public. Life traditional calendars run private, meaning a perfect balance, achieved almost accidentally. Why the world will probably never reform the calendar again despite knowing the Gregorian calendar is slightly imperfect. The world has no intention of replacing it. The reasons are calm, simple, and very human. 1. People don't want another transition, deleting days again, changing the months, reteaching the world how to measure time. No thank you. 2. The Gregorian system is good enough, sure. It's not mathematically perfect, but it works. And modern precision comes from atomic clocks, not calendar tweaks. 3. People like their holidays where they are. Imagine moving Christmas, or shifting New Year, or renumbering the months. Society would riot before breakfast. 4. Technology is already built on the Gregorian system. Billions of databases would break overnight. Software engineers would refuse to participate. Airports would combust emotionally. 5. The Julian calendar already serves its cultural purpose. Nobody's asking it to do anything else. So, the debate is over not because one system defeated the other, but because everyone quietly agreed that a third round would be too exhausting. The role of the Julian calendar in the 21st century. Even now, the Julian calendar still shapes the lives of millions, not in the office, not in the airport, but in all the soft, emotional parts of life in Orthodox communities. Christmas arrives in January. Epiphany flows after. Its certain saints' days follow the old style. Rhythm calendars hang on kitchen walls. With both dates printed, families gather on Old New Year for quiet. Dinners. Old style names for dates survive in local dialects. It's a living tradition, not a relic. Meanwhile, the Gregorian calendar quietly handles taxes, rent payments, train schedules, legal systems, and the rest of the modern machinery. The two systems don't fight anymore. They coexist like old neighbors who learned long ago that arguing doesn't change much anyway. How people explained the missing days when countries switched to the Gregorian calendar and lost days. People didn't respond with outrage as much as with confusion. And confusion breeds stories, little explanations, half-true rumors, and charmingly wrong interpretations. In 1752 England, where 11 days disappeared, people asked, "Are we older now or younger? Did my rent just skip forward? Did the king steal the days? Did the government put the lost days somewhere? Will I get them back eventually?" Nobody understood the astronomy, but everyone understood that time had shifted underneath their feet, and humans do what humans always do. They filled the gap with stories. One popular belief was that the switch shortened people's lives. They joked that the government had literally taken 11 days off the end. Imagine thinking Parliament had the power to subtract time from your lifespan like a celestial accountant. It's mildly adorable. Another rumor claimed the newfangled Gregorian calendar would make people's crops fail because the old dates were spiritually charged. Farmers in parts of Ireland and Scotland insisted on planting by old-style dates for generations after the switch, just in case the sky didn't approve of the new math. People didn't resist the Gregorian calendar violently. They resisted it the same way people resist new phone updates, with suspicion, irreling, and a quiet hope that everything still works afterward. Folklore that survived the every culture handled the calendar transition differently. And the leftover folklore is one of the strangest and most charming parts of the whole saga. In the Scottish Highlands, for decades after the switch, families continued celebrating Old Christmas, which fell on January 5th or 6th Gregorian. They'd insist this was the real Christmas because it matched the old rhythm their ancestors followed. It wasn't about superstition. It was about loyalty to memory in Wales. Certain winter rituals were tied so strongly to Julian dates that even after the Gregorian calendar became official, people preserved the older timing in their local festivals. In some English villages, Old May Day was celebrated well into the 19th century because moving the holiday messed up the rhythm of spring celebrations. You don't just shift a maypole and expect nobody to notice. And in Ireland, a few communities held on to old Halloween Samhain dates far longer than expected, because fire festivals have a way of sticking to their original seasons whether the government approves or not. These weren't political acts. They were emotional, seasonal, cultural, a way of saying, this is when the world feels right. Personal traditions that quietly adapted beyond folklore. The calendar switch shaped countless personal traditions. Some families kept both calendars on the wall. Some recorded birthdays twice, old style and new style. Some celebrated anniversaries by one calendar and saint days by another. Some families argued for decades over which date was the real birthday of a long dead ancestor. Some couples chose wedding dates using whichever calendar promised better weather, as if the Julian system secretly had more influence over the sky. A surprisingly large number of people accidentally lost their birthdays during the transition year. If you were born on September 3rd in England before 1752, you watched the 1752 September calendar jump straight from the 2nd to the 14th. Your birthday just never happened that year. Imagine trying to explain that to a child. Sorry, darling, the government erased your birthday. Yes, they can do that. No, you don't get extra cake. How old-style dates created endless confusion, even after everyone switched calendars. Old-style dates continued causing historical headaches. Genealogists hate them. Historians tolerate them. Archivists quietly curse under their breath every time they open a document from a country that switched late. You can find records like born January 3rd, 1711 OS, or January 14th NS, depending on who you ask. Marriage dated February 10th, but not the February 10th you think died on a date that technically didn't exist in his country that year. But let's not talk about it. And then there's Russia, where every major historical event before 1918 has two dates. If you ever wondered why the October Revolution mostly happened in November, well, the Julian calendar made sure of that dot. Imagine trying to run a revolution and still having to convert your meeting schedules between two calendars. Absolute chaos, but in a very polite, paperwork-heavy way. How calendar confusion became comedy as the centuries rolled on. People started joking about the Julian-Gregorian mismatch. The confusion became part of the charm in England. Jokes circulated that the continent was ahead in time because it used the Gregorian calendar. English writers teased Europeans for living in the future, and Europeans teased the English for living in the past. A very polite international roast battle in parts of Eastern Europe. People cracked jokes about having two Christmases or two New Years and treated it like a bonus. One holiday for the church, one for the government, and maybe one for the household cat. A famous Balkan joke went something like, "We celebrate New Year twice. One for tradition, and one for when the shops are open. There are worse ways to live." The Julian-Gregorian divide in family life, one of the more subtle consequences of the calendar divide, is what it did to family stories. You'll find diaries where a grandmother writes in, Julian dates and her granddaughter switches to Gregorian dates halfway through the same notebook. You'll find old baptismal records with two dates squeezed onto the page, written in different handwriting, possibly by different priests. You'll find marriages recorded on one calendar and anniversaries celebrated on another, because the family quietly decided that one date felt more correct in multi-generational households. Especially in Orthodox countries, the two calendars became part of family negotiations. What day is the feast? Which calendar are we using this year? Both? Okay. Calendar blending became a very normal part of life. The quiet afterlife of the debate by the time we reach the modern age. Something interesting has happened. The calendar debate no longer divides anyone. It just adds flavor to life. The Gregorian calendar does its job, keeping the global world in sync. The Julian calendar drifts peacefully, anchoring cultural memory. Lunar calendars guide festivals across Asia and the Middle East. People live inside several layers of time without stress, and the debate that once involved popes, emperors, monarchs, astronomers, merchants, and entire nations has become something far softer, a curiosity, a tradition, a background hum, a thing you vaguely remember reading about while trying to fall asleep in a way. The Julian-Gregorian saga found its true ending, not in 1918 or 1923 or 2000, but in the moment when people stopped seeing the calendars as competing systems and started seeing them as different ways of experiencing the year. Time became plural, flexible, gently inconsistent, exactly the way humans prefer it. The calendar as a cultural flag once, the dust settled from the Gregorian switch, and the Julian calendar drifted off into its quieter religious niche. Something subtle happened. The calendar you used became part of the cultural badge you wore. You could tell a lot about a community simply by how it marked. The year, Western Europe, Gregorian Orthodox. East, Julian, East Asia, lunar and lunar solar, blends, Middle East, Hijri lunar Ethiopia, its own ancient system indigenous communities. Their own seasonal cycles time became a kind of soft international language, one with accents, dialects, and polite disagreements. In Eastern Orthodox countries especially, the Julian calendar became something like a quiet cultural flag, not loud, not political, more like a familiar scarf passed down the family line. You don't wear it every day, but when you do, it feels like home. Even today, Russian, Serbian, Georgian, and Ukrainian families who celebrate Christmas on January 7th aren't saying the Gregorian system is wrong. They're saying, our rhythm is older, and we're keeping it because it feels like us. It's not rebellion. It's heritage, national identity, and the calendar switched. Some countries tied their identity so strongly to a calendar that switching felt like a cultural earthquake. Take Greece, for instance. When the civil government finally adopted the Gregorian system in 1923, the Orthodox Church hesitated. Too much tradition was embedded in Julian dates. Too many festivals. Too many rhythms that had shaped villages and families for centuries, so the result was a cultural compromise. The country runs on Gregorian time, the Church keeps. Major feasts on the Julian cycle families balance both. Without losing sleep, Granny celebrates Christmas in early January. Grandkids celebrate New Year on January 1st, and nobody argues about it because it keeps the peace. Or look at Ethiopia, where the national calendar remains one of the world's oldest and entirely its own. 13 months, a different New Year, a different count of years, and an unwavering confidence about it. Ethiopians didn't switch to match Western expectations. They simply added the Gregorian system as needed for international business, 2 calendars side by side. One for the world, one for the soul, calendars as quiet resistance in some places. Sticking to an older calendar became a political statement. In the Balkans during the Ottoman era, Julian feast days weren't just religious. They were cultural resistance, a way of saying, we are still here. A calendar that the empire didn't follow became a shield of identity. People didn't fight over it. They just kept their rhythm, quietly and stubbornly, year after year, and later, during Soviet times. Some Orthodox communities held on to old-style dates, partly as a spiritual anchor. Life changed. Factories appeared. Cities expanded. The official calendar was red and secular. But inside kitchens and churches, the Julian calendar kept its ancestral glow. Time, in these cases, wasn't just a neutral structure. It was a quiet no. Holidays that split in two. One of the strangest consequences of this centuries-long debate is that some holidays doubled. New Year's is the classic example. Some Eastern European countries observe January 1st for the global New Year, January 14. For Old New Year, Julian II, one is softer, sleepier, less fireworks, more food, a holiday without pressure. A holiday designed, it seems, for tired people who can't be bothered making resolutions twice. And then there's Christmas, December 25th Gregorian, January 7th Gregorian, but December 25th Julian in many families. The atmosphere is something like, do we celebrate on the 25th? Yes, and the 7th? Probably. Why not? And the kids, they get gifts both times. Nobody loses. Seasonal festivals in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Russia often followed Julian timing even after the Gregorian switch. Certain folk rituals, crop blessings, first foot traditions, fire festivals, kept their Julian dates because that's when they felt right. When governments say the date changed, and villagers say no, it did not, guess who wins? The villagers? Every time the calendar in immigrant communities, when people move, they carry their calendar with them, Greek, Russian, Serbian, Ethiopian, Coptic, Ukrainian, and Romanian communities across the world quietly keep Julian feast days alive in foreign time zones. Christmas on January 7th in Toronto. Old New Year dinners in Chicago. Julian Saints' Day celebrated in Melbourne. It doesn't matter where the family lives. The rhythm travels, and this creates some charming cultural combinations. Kids follow the Gregorian school. Calendar parents follow work. Schedules grandparents follow the Julian or traditional festival cycle, and everyone participates. In whichever holiday has the best food, calendars blend like languages, flexible, natural, human. How calendars shape family stories. Some families still tell stories like, your great-grandfather was born old style. Our wedding was Julian, but we celebrated Gregorian. His birthday is January 2nd, or maybe January 14th. There are families who keep two sets of dates in their memory, not out of confusion, out of affection. It's the same way people keep two names for their grandparents, an official one and a home one. For some older relatives, the Julian calendar isn't an outdated system. It's childhood. It's villages. It's candles in church. It's the smell of winter feasts on the old dates. It's identity wrapped in a slightly drifting number. And that's why the Julian calendar never dies. It isn't a tool. It's a memory palace. When calendars become regional personalities, you zoom out. You can feel the personality of each calendar. Gregorian, organized, slightly bossy. Handles paperwork. Julian, gentle, traditional. Lets the seasons shift around it. Lunar calendars, mystical, poetic, guided by the sky. Hijri, tied to faith. Anchored by the moon. Ethiopian, proudly independent. Tindinus calendars, rooted in land, animals, migration, weather. When people choose their calendar, they're choosing a worldview. They're choosing a relationship with time itself. Calendar gaps as historical shadows, one last ripple before this chunk ends. The calendar switch left permanent ghosts in historical memory. There are events celebrated on different days, depending on which calendar you trust. There are heroes whose birth dates move around depending on the historian. There are revolutions that happened in October, only if you squint at a Julian date. And there are entire centuries where two calendars lived side by side, casting overlapping shadows on legal documents, family records, and public life. Time became a double exposure, two histories layered onto each other. And somehow, people functioned just fine. How holidays refuse to agree with each other in the modern world. Most international holidays follow the Gregorian calendar. December 25th means Christmas. January 1st means New Year. October 31st means Halloween. Valentine's Day, Easter, Mother's Day. Black Friday, they all happen on dates that get printed on millions of calendars, synced to phones, and matched to global shopping cycles. But then the Julian calendar walks in like an elderly relative showing up late to dinner, smiling politely, and insisting that the real celebration is actually today. So in much of the Orthodox world, Christmas is January. 7 New Year has a double version. Epiphany is mid-January. Julian Easter sometimes lands weeks apart from the Western dating. Feasts drift deeper into the seasons every century. This creates a cultural rhythm that's slightly out of step with the global one, but in a gentle, harmonious way. Countries like Serbia, Georgia, Russia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro all live with a double holiday cycle. Nobody complains. If anything, they treat it like a 2-for-1 festival deal. Ask someone, when's Christmas? And they'll say, well, which one? It's honestly kind of charming. A world that once fought over calendars now treats the difference as a reason to eat more food. Globalization brings new layers of time with the rise of international travel, tourism, and digital communication. The modern world now moves on what feels like a shared global calendar. New Year's fireworks appear on screens worldwide. World Cup matches happen on fixed Gregorian dates. Big movie releases have coordinated global premieres. Even time zones get carefully managed so stock markets don't accidentally sink to the wrong hour. But even in this structured world, the old calendar rhythms persist. A Russian family living in Paris may celebrate December 25th with co-workers, then January 7th at home. A Greek grandmother living in Melbourne might follow old-style feast days, even though her grandchildren operate entirely on the Australian school calendar. A Serbian diaspora community in Chicago might attend to Easter liturgies, one Gregorian, one Julian, because both feel meaningful. Global time organizes life. Old calendars organize identity. One keeps the trains running. The other keeps the soul warm. The tourism economy discovers old Christmas. Tourism boards eventually realized that having 2 sets of holidays is fantastic for business. Suddenly, places that follow old-style dates could celebrate Christmas twice and attract visitors twice. In some Balkan towns, January 7th has become a soft second tourism season. Markets reopen. Folk dancers return. Restaurants run old Christmas menus. Travelers come for the novelty, the slower pace, the winter atmosphere that feels cozy instead of commercial. It's an entire economy built on a 16th century calendar reform. Even the phrase Old Christmas has become a selling point. It sounds nostalgic and mystical, like the holiday's quieter, more traditional cousin who still believes in homemade sweets, candlelight, and wool blankets. The Julian calendar drifting by 13 days accidentally created a tourism niche. Businesses learn to live. With calendar drift, modern companies have to deal with the dual calendar. Reality more than you'd think. HR departments in some regions track both holiday systems. International teams communicate across cultures with different feast days. Schools schedule breaks based on Gregorian dates, but churches schedule fasts and feasts by Julian. Time apps offer dual calendar widgets. Some reminders say Christmas Orthodox. Automatically, global work calendars show both Easter dates when they diverge. It, not chaotic. It's just another layer of routine. Imagine planning a work meeting and someone says, I can't do Tuesday, it's Julian, Epiphany. Everyone else nods. Problem solved. The modern workplace has quietly adapted to a centuries-old drift without making a fuss. It's actually kind of wholesome. Digital calendars keep both systems alive. Here's a fun twist. The internet made it easier than ever to preserve old-time systems. Phone apps, calendar software, and digital planners. Allow people to add Julian feast, Dizad Luna. Festival Strak, Ethiopian dates follow, Jewish and Islamic. Holidays convert dates automatically sync. Local traditions with global schedules. The Gregorian calendar might power the digital backbone, but the Julian calendar and dozens of others ride comfortably on top. Computers didn't erase cultural calendars, they protected them. Your phone knows when old-style Christmas is coming. It knows when Orthodox Easter falls. It knows when Ethiopian New Year begins. It knows when the Hydri calendar turns over. Humanity has never been more globally synchronized, never had an easier time keeping its many calendars alive. Why modern people still care about old-style dates at this point? You might wonder why people still care about the Julian dates at all. It's not about science. It's not about politics. It's not even about accuracy. It's about meaning. People keep old feast days for the same reason they keep family recipes, home languages, and traditional dances. Not because they're efficient, because they're familiar, because they're comforting, because generations did it this way and the rhythm feels good. Julian dates aren't just dates. They're cultural memory, for an Orthodox Christian lighting candles in January. The Julian calendar isn't misaligned, it's sacred. For an Irish family celebrating Old Halloween, the Julian date feels more magical. For a Scottish village celebrating Old New Year, the holiday feels truer. Calendars are less about perfect astronomy and more about emotional truth. The Julian-Gregorian debate becomes a quiet background habit by the 21st century. The debate stopped being a debate. It turned into a kind of gentle cohabitation. One calendar runs the global world, one calendar carries the old world, both coexist beautifully. Nobody is trying to convert anyone else. Nobody is waving banners demanding a return to Julian dates. Nobody is asking the Orthodox world to abandon its rhythm. Nobody is forcing the Gregorian system to revise itself again. The two calendars simply exist side by side, like parallel rivers, different flows, same landscape, and people move between them the way they move between cultures, languages, and traditions, naturally, intuitively, without trouble. The hidden calendar in your daily life. Most people don't think about calendars unless they're late for something, planning something, or trying to remember why the dentist appointment feels suspiciously far away, but tucked inside the Gregorian structure. You probably use every day are the leftovers of thousands of years of trial and error. Part 10 is about those leftovers, the quiet fingerprints history left on your planner, your reminders app, and the international holidays folder you ignore on your phone. You don't see the Julian-Gregorian divide when you schedule a meeting, but it's there, hidden in places like the length of the year, the date of Easter, the timing of school breaks, the drifting of religious holidays, the shape of the months, the quirky unevenness of the calendar itself. For example, the reason February feels like the calendar's little brother who never gets enough attention. Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar fought over month lengths, because of course they did. The reason Easter moves around every year like a bored cat wandering between windows. It's calculated using an extremely ancient and extremely tired attempt to reconcile lunar and solar cycles. The reason September, October, November, and December are named after the numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10 of them, though they're actually months 9, 10, 11, and 12, because the Roman calendar reorganized itself one too many times. And at some point, everyone just gave up on renaming things. Your calendar is basically a collage of ancient mistakes wearing a modern suit. Your phone runs Gregorian time. With Julian echoes if you open your phone calendar right now. You'll see Gregorian dates so-so, week numbers, lunar phases, regional holidays, optional, Julian feast, days and a digital clock synced to atomic time Mitsalot. Your phone keeps more ways of measuring time than an entire medieval monastery, and here's the strange part. The Gregorian calendar only works so neatly on your device because programmers spent decades building conversion tools that constantly fix what the human mind doesn't. Notice, your phone knows when Easter falls, using 2 different calculations when Orthodox Christmas happens, when to mark Julian Epiphany. Lunar calendars reset how to reconcile Jewish, Islamic, Chinese, and Ethiopian holidays. The digital world didn't erase the old calendar systems. It preserved them carefully, respectfully. Quietly, a smartphone is basically the United Nations of calendars. Why modern people still celebrate old style. Dates. One of the gentlest outcomes of the calendar debate is how many places still celebrate old style holidays simply because they feel right. These include Old Christmas in parts of Scotland and Ireland, Old New Year in Eastern Europe, Old Halloween in a few Celtic communities, Epiphany in Orthodox countries, agricultural festivals in the Balkans, tied to Julian dates, seasonal rites in Romania and Moldova, ancestral feast days that families keep without questioning the date mismatch. These holidays aren't protests. They're comfort rituals. The Julian calendar survived not because it's efficient, but because it feels like home in the quiet parts of life: cooking, gathering, praying, storytelling, lighting candles in rooms that smell like winter and childhood. The Gregorian calendar organizes work. The Julian calendar organizes memory. How the calendar shapes seasons without you noticing. In regions that abandoned the Julian system centuries ago, the older rhythm left marks on seasonal traditions. For example, some agricultural customs still follow the old seasonal markers. Fishing seasons in certain coasts echo pre-reformed timings. Weather sayings, if it rains on Old Michaelmas, survive long after Old Michaelmas lost its date. Winter folklore often lines up more neatly with Julian dates than Gregorian ones. Planting days, harvest days, and rural fairs in parts of Europe still show ghost traces of the old-style year. The Julian calendar drifts from the seasons now, but the memory of its alignment stuck around. Cultural inertia is one of the most underrated forces in history. People adapt to new calendars, but their traditions don't always follow immediately. Some take decades. Some take centuries. Some never fully shift. The calendar debate and the modern sense of time. In Part 10, we touch the big idea, how this debate shaped the modern understanding of time. Because the Julian-Gregorian transition didn't just change dates, it changed how people thought about time. The Gregorian calendar made time feel work weeks anchored, business cycles defined school terms, standardized fiscal years allowed governments to coordinate. To universal time zones enabled international travel, prepared society for the digital age. The Julian calendar left behind a sense of seasonal memory, traditional rhythms, cultural timing, ancestral continuity, soft resistance to overstructure, reminder that time used to be emotional, not mechanical. Put those together, and you get the modern world. Part science, part tradition, part convenience, part nostalgia. The debate didn't produce a winner. It produced a hybrid way of experiencing time. Time became both external and internal, both structured and sentimental, both universal and deeply personal. Two calendars, one humanity as we ease toward the midpoint of Part 10. Here's the gentle truth. You live with echoes of both calendars every day. Gregorian time organizes your responsibilities. Julian time shapes the world's oldest rituals. Lunar time defines cultural festivals. Atomic time guides your devices. Solar time dictates the seasons, whether you notice or not. You're not living in one time system. You're floating peacefully in several. That's the true legacy of the long calendar debate. Not confusion, not conflict, but a layered humanity that learned to hold multiple identities at once.